Hi, welcome back. Today we'll be learning how to copy data between Excel files. So what is the purpose of this session? The purpose is to copy data present in every sheet of the source file to the target file without any manual work. So how can this be achieved? This can be done in two different ways. The first method is by mapping the fields present in source file with the fields in the target file. And the second method is by copying the entire sheet without any field mapping. So why should we do this? This reduces a lot of manual work, it is time saving, and it is more accurate as it will not have any human errors. Let's look into the first method. So the first method is by mapping the fields present in source file with the fields in the target file. This method involves four different steps. So the first step is to create a button. This button allows the user to start the copy process. Next, we should create an user form. This user form allows the user to select the source file from which the data needs to be copied. And third is creating a mapping sheet. This mapping sheet will have fields and their cell reference numbers. And finally, will write a VBA script that copies the data. Let's look into an example. So here I have created a button that starts the copy process. So when user clicks on this button, an user form called copy data will be visible. The user form has a text box and two different buttons. So the select source file button helps user to select the file from which the data needs to be copied. So when user clicks on this button, a dialog box will pop up where user can select the file from which the data needs to be copied. So once user clicks on OK, the selected file will be opened in the background and the file name will be stored in this text box. So once the file name is stored, when user clicks on copy data, the entire data from the source file will be copied to the target file. Look into the third step, that is the mapping sheet. So in this mapping sheet, I have stored all the field names and its cell references along with the sheet type. So basically, there are two types of sheets. One is form and the other one is table. Let's look into the differences between form and a table. Form is a type of sheet where it contains the field name and the value in the same row, whereas table contains field name and its values in the same column. For example, if we look into student details 10, the field name and its value are present in the same row, that is row 5. Similarly, if we look into the marks sheet, the field name and its values are present in same column, that is column D. So in general, table types will have many values for single field, whereas form types will have only single value for single field. But there are some cases where form types may also contain multiple values in the same row. Now let us look into the code. If I right click on this button and click on assign macro, as you can already see, I have assigned a macro to this button. So I'll just click on edit. So the copy data button basically shows an user form. That user form is stored in user form 1. So let us look into user form 1. So user form 1 contains a text box and two different buttons. So text box basically stores the file name. So it doesn't have any specific script. So let us look into select source file code. So the first step in select source file code is to store the target file name in a variable called target. And the next is to open the dialog box with the help of MSO file dialog file picker. So before we open, we should set allow multi-select to false, set title to please select, and clear all filters. And once you clear all the filters, set few filters where it will enable only Excel files, so that user can select only Excel file and does not select any other file format. User will select the source file. Once user selects the source file, we'll store the file name and its path in a variable called text file name. So basically, this particular variable will have the entire path of that file. And with the help of this text file name variable, we are fetching the file name alone and we are storing it in file name. And once this is done, we are unloading user form 1. As when a user form is opened, we won't be able to open any other file or proceed with any other function. So we are unloading user form 1, then we'll open the file with the help of the entire path. Once we open the path, we are activating our target workbook, that is our new file. Once we activate it, we are storing the file name in the text box present in the user form. Once we store the file name, we are opening the user form again so that user will be able to click on copy data button. Now let's check the copy data code. So this code will be executed when user clicks on copy data button. So initially we are storing the target and source file names in two different variables. After storing the names, we are checking if source is empty or not. If source is empty, then we'll show this warning message as user would have not selected any source file. If source is not empty, then we'll activate the source workbook and we'll call list sheet sub with two input arguments, target and source. In list sheet sub, we initially activate the source workbook and we'll check if the workbook contains a sheet name called copy data. As in our current workbook, this is the first sheet name. So if this is not present in the workbook, then we'll display a warning message saying, please select the correct file. As user might select any other Excel file with a different template. So we won't be able to copy data from that template. So if the selected workbook contains copy data, then we'll unload user form 1 and we'll activate our current workbook, that is our target workbook. After activating the workbook, we'll store the source file name in any one cell. Here I stored it in cell A11. So after storing the file, we'll activate user form 2. Now let's look into code of user form 2. User form 2 is a progress bar. When this progress bar is activated, load data sub will be called with two input arguments, source and target. So in load data, initially we'll set screen updating to false, calculation to Excel calculation automatic, and enable events to false. Next, let us set A and B to source and target respectively. First, activate the mapping sheet of our target workbook. Once that is done, let us find which is the last row that contains value in our mapping sheet and store the row number in a variable called lrow. Store the total number of students present in the sheet called marks. So if we look into our marks sheet, here the total number of students are 10. So this variable will be stored in that. So this value will be stored in the variable called number of students. So for each and every row in our mapping sheet, fetch the sheet type from column D and fetch the sheet name from column E of our mapping sheet. So if the sheet type is form, then fetch the cell number from column C. If the sheet type is table, then let us fetch the cell number from column B. So if we look into our mapping sheet, so this mapping sheet contains start cell and end cell. For form, we'll have start cell and end cell. The start cell is the field name cell, and whereas the end cell is the field value cell. So if we look into an example, student detail sheet is a form type. So here column C contains the field names and column E contains the field values. For table type, the start cell will be the cell from where the values will start, whereas the end cell is the column name. So if you look into the mark sheet, here for students, the value starts from 8 and it ends from 10. Sometimes the number of rows may be more than 10. So in that scenarios, we are just storing the column value, that is D. So first, if our sheet type is form, then we'll be fetching our cell number. With the help of the cell number, we'll fetch the value from workbook A and copy that value to workbook B. Whereas if it is a table, then we'll fetch the cell number from column B and the column number from column C. So with the help of cell number and column number, we'll copy the entire range from workbook A and paste it in workbook B. So once the entire copy process is done, empty the cell where you stored the source file name and unload user form 2. So once this is done, once the user form is unloaded, we'll display a message called copied data. So after this, we'll just set our screen updating to true, enable events to true, and calculation to Excel calculation automatic. Now let us look how the process exactly works. So if you see this particular sheet, workbook called student method 1 copy is an empty workbook. It doesn't have any value in it. So now let us copy values to this workbook. So I'll select the source file. The source file will be present here. So I have selected the source file. This particular file contains data filled in it. So it just opened the file in the background. Now I'll just click on copy data. So the entire copy process took around 2 to 3 seconds. So now if we look into our sheets, the data from the other workbook is copied here. Similarly, in our mark sheet, if we look into the mark sheet, the entire data is copied from our data sheet. So we can even compare the data present in our copy sheet. So this is the data that was copied from the data sheet to the copy sheet. So now you know how to copy data between Excel files using first method. Now let's look into the second method. So the second method is by copying the entire sheet without any field mapping. So even this method has 4 different steps. So the first step is to create a button. So this button allows user to start the copy process. And the second step is to create an user form. This user form allows user to select the source file from which the data needs to be copied. And third is creating a temporary sheet. This temporary sheet basically stores the sheet names. And fourth step is to write a VBA script that copies the data. So let's look into an example. So here in this example, I have created a button called copy data method 2 as first step. And as our second step, when user clicks on this button, this user form called copy data will be displayed, same as in first method. It contains a text box and 2 different buttons. So basically the first button again allows the user to select the source file, whereas the second button allows the user to copy data. Now let's look into our third step. Our third step is temporary sheet. This temporary sheet basically contains all the sheet names present in this workbook. Now let us look into the code. So user form 1 contains a text box and 2 different buttons. So here the text box again doesn't have any script, and select source file, as we have seen in method 1, the same entire process is used in method 2 as well. So let's get into copy data. In copy data, initially we are checking if the source is empty or not. If the source is not empty, then we are calling list sheets. In list sheets, we are cross-verifying if the worksheets are the same. If worksheets are same, then we'll unload user form 1 and we'll load user form 2. So in user form 2, so basically user form 2 is a progress bar again. So initially we'll call load data sub with two input arguments, source and target. So in load data, we'll set screen updating to false, calculation to Excel calculation automatic, and enable events to false. These three will help us reduce runtime. Let us set A and B to source and target. So once that is done, we are activating our temporary sheet. After activating our temporary sheet, let us find which is the last row that contains value in the temporary sheet and store the row number in a variable called L row. And let us store number of students in a variable called number of students that we fetch from our mark sheet. So for each and every row in our temporary sheet, we will fetch the sheet name from column A. And we should make sure that the sheet is visible in both workbook B and workbook A. So once the sheets are visible, let us just copy the first maybe 1000 or 2000 rows from column A to Z from workbook A and paste the entire thing in workbook B. So what this basically does is it will copy the entire data at a time and paste it at a time. So the template present in our workbook B will be lost and the template from workbook A will be copied. So once the entire copy process is done, we'll just empty out the cell A11 where we stored the source name and we'll unload user form 1. So once user form 1 is unloaded, user form 2 is unloaded, we'll display a message stating copied data. Now let's look how method 2 works. So if we look into this particular workbook, the entire workbook is empty. It doesn't have any template. The sheets are empty. Even the mark sheet is completely empty. So when we copy the data, let us select the source file. So this particular sheet has data in it. So the sheet is opened in the background. Let us copy the data. So now if we check our sheet, the entire data and the template from that particular workbook is copied to this workbook. Even in each and every sheet. Let us look into the advantages and disadvantages of each method. So, advantage of first method is previous template won't be lost. So the template of the copied file will remain the same, as we'll just copy the field values and not the entire sheet. The disadvantage of this method is sheet names and field names should be the same. If sheet names and field names are different, then it might cause some issues. And the entire process is complex, and the process is complex especially while creating the mapping sheet. On to the next method. The advantage of second method is the process is simple and the field names can be different, as we'll copy the entire sheet. The disadvantage is that the template of the target sheet will be changed and previous template will be lost. So the template present in our new file will be removed and it will be replaced with the old file. So thus this is the disadvantage. Now you know how to copy data between Excel files using these two methods. Thank you.